Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're going to take a quiet walk through the streets of Lower Manhattan back in the spring of 1979. You'll hear the distant hum of delivery trucks, the barking of a corner grocer's dog, and the sound of children still half asleep dragging their feet toward the school bus. But in the middle of all that noise, there's one little voice that fades into silence, and that silence has haunted America for more than 4 decades. Yes, a disappearance has occurred. A boy is about to vanish, and the ripple from that moment will change the way parents in America think forever. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what your neighborhood looks like when kids walk to school. You might even connect with someone closer than you think. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. The year was 1979. The city of New York was in transition. The crime rate was high. Neighborhoods like Soho were still rough around the edges, and parents lived with a constant tension between wanting to protect their kids and wanting to give them independence. In one second-floor loft on Prince Street, Etan Patz, a 6-year-old boy with sandy blonde hair, freckles, and an innocent smile, was getting ready for school. He pulled on his striped shirt, one he liked because it made him feel grown up. He adjusted his little Eastern Airlines cap, something he'd begged his dad to get him after a family friend who worked for the airline gave him a souvenir pin. He slung his book bag over one shoulder. It was almost bigger than him, swaying side to side as he walked. Etan had been asking his mother, Julie, for weeks, "Can I go to the bus stop all by myself?" His parents had said no over and over, but this morning felt different. The sun was shining, the air had that early summer warmth, and Julie relented. She thought, it's only 2 blocks. What could happen in 2 blocks? She walked him to the door, gave him a kiss on the head, and reminded him, go straight to the bus stop, no detours. Don't talk to strangers. Etan smiled, proud. For a 6-year-old, this was independence. This was freedom. And so, at around 8 a.m., Etan Patz left home for the very last time. Imagine the streets of Soho then, not the trendy art galleries and upscale boutiques you know today, but warehouses, cobblestone streets, old cast-iron buildings with fading paint. Back then, the neighborhood was just starting to attract artist people who wanted big loft spaces for cheap rent. Families like the Patz family lived side by side with shopkeepers and laborers. The streets were full of delivery trucks, the clatter of roll-up doors, and the occasional honk of a frustrated taxi driver. Etan's small figure weaved into that scenery, just one more kid on the way to school. Except he wasn't. He was alone. As he rounded the corner onto West Broadway, the bus was waiting. Children climbed aboard, backpacks bouncing, voices chattering. But Etan never reached that line. Somewhere between his loft and that bus stop, his trail simply disappeared. The school never noticed right away. Attendance records in 1979 weren't computerized. Teachers sometimes overlooked absences, assuming parents had called in. No alarm bells rang that morning. Hours ticked by. Etan's parents assumed he was safe in class. It wasn't until the afternoon, when Julie Patz walked to pick him up, that she realized something was horribly wrong. The teacher said Etan wasn't here today. And in that moment, the bottom dropped out of Julie's world. This is where things take on that surreal quality you often hear in missing persons cases. How does a child, a small boy, vanish in broad daylight on a short walk through a crowded New York street? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the first moments of this case were its undoing, whether a call here, a question there, might have changed the outcome. One strange detail that would later become important: multiple neighbors said they remembered seeing Etan that morning. A shopkeeper thought he saw him pass by. A neighbor swore she saw his striped shirt. But when investigators traced the timeline, it was like trying to hold smoke in their hands. The sightings contradicted each other. Some placed him near the corner, some placed him halfway down the block. And some may have imagined him there after the fact, because the idea of not seeing him at all was too horrifying. By early evening, Soho was buzzing. Flyers were being run off on copy machines. Neighbors were scouring basements, hallways, rooftops. Julie's voice echoed through the street, calling out his name. Stan Patz, Etan's father, rushed home from his photography studio, his face pale and rigid with shock. This was the beginning of a story that would last not just hours, not just days, but decades. A boy vanished, a city would panic, and America would never again look at the words missing child the same way. The last confirmed sighting of Etan Patz was that morning leaving his Prince Street loft. After that, it was as if the city itself had swallowed him whole. The hours between morning and afternoon on that May day in 1979 are like an empty corridor, silent, unaccounted for, and echoing with questions. Etan Patz left his family's loft on Prince Street, turned the corner toward the bus stop, and then the story simply collapses into mystery. The school bus driver remembered the morning clearly. He waited the usual couple of minutes, idling at the curb on West Broadway. Children ran up with untied shoelaces and crumpled lunch bags, laughing as they jostled into seats. But no small boy in a striped shirt appeared at the corner. And the driver, like so many adults in the city at that time, shrugged it off. Maybe Etan was running late, maybe he stayed home, buses left on time. That was the rule. Inside the classroom, the teacher marked attendance. One empty desk did not ring any alarms. New York schools in 1979 had overcrowded rooms and chaotic mornings. Kids forgot notes from parents, or they played hooky. A missing child for one day was not unusual, so Etan's absence slipped quietly past the system, unchallenged, unremarked. Back at home, Julie Patz went about her day. She taught children in their loft, she ran a small daycare, and in between lessons, she thought about how proud Etan had been. His first solo walk to the bus stop, a milestone. She smiled to herself, unaware that those steps had led not to school, but into silence. It wasn't until the afternoon, when she walked to meet the bus, that the dread first tightened around her chest. The line of children filed off, one by one, familiar faces, but not Etan's. She asked the driver, "Did Etan get on this morning?" The driver frowned, shook his head. "No, I didn't see him." Julie's stomach dropped. In that moment, she felt the ground shift under her feet. She ran to the school, certain there had been a mistake. But the teacher confirmed it. Etan wasn't in class today. This is the moment every parent fears, the sharp cut from assumption to terror. One second you think your child is safe. The next you're standing in a void. Julie hurried home, panic swelling like a tide. She called her husband Stan, who was working at his photography studio. His voice on the phone cracked. He left immediately, sprinting through the city streets. Neighbors began to notice the commotion. The word spread fast. Etan was missing. By early evening, the sidewalks of Soho were alive with activity. Friends, neighbors, even strangers joined the search. People opened basement doors, climbed up staircases, shouted into alleys. Etan, Etan. His name echoed against the cast iron buildings, but no voice answered back. The police were called. Detectives arrived, but their pace was measured, almost casual. In 1979, missing child protocols were not what they are today. Back then, the assumption was often that a child had wandered off, maybe run away, and would turn up soon. That was the first critical mistake. The Patz family knew immediately Etan would never just wander off. He was cautious, shy, and had been given strict instructions. Something was wrong, but the system moved slowly. One strange detail from that night stands out even now. The Patz family's cat returned home, meowing at the door, pacing nervously. Julie remembered thinking, even the cat knows something is off. She later told friends it felt like the whole atmosphere of their home had changed, like the walls were vibrating with loss. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether those first 12 hours sealed the case's fate, whether faster action might have uncovered a critical lead. Some argue that by the time the search truly began, Etan was already gone, far beyond their reach. Stan Patz, a professional photographer, did something unusual. He had hundreds of photos of his son, clear, detailed portraits. Within hours, flyers bearing Etan's smiling face were circulating through the city. His image spread faster than almost any missing child in history up to that point. That night, as the city darkened and streetlights flickered on, Julie and Stan sat in their loft, staring at the door as if willing Etan to walk back through it. But he didn't, and he never would. The vanishing of Etan Patz was complete. A boy walked out his front door 2 blocks from safety and dissolved into thin air. No body, no witness who saw the exact moment, just absence. And absence is the hardest thing to fight against. By the time the sun dipped behind the rooftops of Soho on May 25, 1979, the quiet cobblestone neighborhood had transformed into something unrecognizable. Doors swung open, neighbors poured into the street, and the air filled with shouts of a child's name, Etan. The Patz family's block was suddenly alive with flashlights and worried faces. People who barely knew each other, shopkeepers, artists, truck drivers, banded together with a shared urgency. They combed stairwells, tapped on basement doors, even checked the dumpsters lined up along the alleys. What's chilling is this Etan wasn't just missing. He had slipped through the cracks of a city too distracted to notice. And now, in the cold glow of the street lamps, the realization settled in something was terribly wrong. Julie Patz clutched the flyers that Stan had run off using his professional photography prints. Unlike most missing child posters of the era, these weren't grainy school snapshots. They were vivid, full-faced images, almost unsettlingly clear. His eyes looked directly at you, wide and innocent, the kind of picture you couldn't ignore. Stan taped one to a lamppost himself, his hand trembling as the glue smeared across the metal. The photo seemed to accuse everyone who looked at it. Why didn't you protect me? The NYPD presence grew by the hour, but there was hesitation, a sense that this was just a search for a lost boy who had wandered off. Detectives organized volunteers into rough grids sweeping outward from Prince Street. But New York was too vast, too porous. You can't seal a city. And for every basement they opened, there were 10 more that stayed locked. One strange detail lingers from those first sweeps. A handyman was spotted standing in the doorway of a basement on Worcester Street just blocks away. He smoked slowly, watching the chaos. When asked if he'd seen the boy, he shrugged, his eyes cold. Detectives noted his name, but he was waved off as just another neighborhood oddball. Later, many would wonder, was that a chance to stop the story from spiraling? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the early focus on street-level searches missed the more obvious truth that this was not a boy lost in the neighborhood, but a boy who had been taken. By midnight, the search was frantic. Neighbors whispered theories. Maybe Etan had been hit by a car, and the driver panicked. Maybe he'd been lured into a building. Maybe he was just asleep on a friend's couch. But as hours passed, hope dimmed. The strange rhythm of Soho, the usual clang of trucks unloading, the hiss of steam rising from manhole covers, was replaced with the sound of boots, the tearing of tape as flyers went up, and the low hum of fear. Julie, exhausted, sat on the stoop of their building, rocking slightly. She whispered over and over he was just 2 blocks away, just 2 blocks, as if repeating the distance could undo the reality. Inside the loft, the other Patz children slept fitfully, unaware of the tidal wave about to crash down on their family. Stan stayed awake all night, staring at the phone, waiting for a call that never came. The next morning, Etan's photo began spreading across the city. Subways, street corners, diners, his little face was suddenly everywhere. The New York Post ran a short piece. By Sunday, national media had picked up the story. A missing child in New York wasn't new, but the clarity of Etan's image and the raw desperation of his parents gripped the country. One woman later recalled that seeing his flyer on the subway made her stomach knot. She didn't know Etan, but she recognized the truth in his eyes: innocence and danger. This was no longer just a neighborhood panic. This was the beginning of a national obsession. But in those first days, as Soho turned itself inside out, there was still no sign of Etan. No lunchbox abandoned in an alley, no cap dropped on the curb, just absence again and again. The panic had expanded beyond the family, beyond the block, and yet the city still whispered the same question in the shadows: where is Etan Patz? The morning after Etan Patz vanished, Soho woke to a new soundscape: the thrum of police radios. Black and white patrol cars lined Prince Street. Detectives in short-sleeved shirts leaned against lampposts, notepads in hand. The Patz building, once just another quiet loft in an artsy neighborhood, had become the epicenter of a mystery. At first, the NYPD treated the disappearance with the same weary tone they used for countless missing person calls. In 1979, the prevailing assumption was simple: kids ran away. Children disappeared every week in New York, and almost always they turned up at a friend's house or back home after a scolding. The idea of stranger abductions was seen as vanishingly rare. But as Julie Patz told officers over and over, Etan was not the kind of boy to run away. He was shy, careful, even cautious. And he had been so proud of being allowed to walk to the bus stop. It wasn't a rebellion, it was a rite of passage. Still, officers fanned out in a mechanical rhythm. They knocked on doors, interviewed shopkeepers, combed rooftops. Stan handed detectives Eaton's favorite toy truck just so they could know the boy they were searching for. "Find my son," he begged. One odd moment stood out in those first days. A police officer stationed near the corner where Eaton was last seen noted a man sitting on a stoop staring intently at the flyers being taped up. The man muttered something under his breath, then walked away quickly. The officer didn't stop him. It was just one of hundreds of strange sightings that meant nothing, or maybe everything. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these early leads were squandered in the fog of confusion. Did the police underestimate the danger because Eaton's case looked at first glance like all the others, or were they already chasing a phantom who knew how to stay invisible? The Patz family loft became a command post. Detectives carried in maps, radios, piles of reports. Julie brewed coffee for officers who stayed late. Stan, exhausted, sat with reporters who kept pushing. "Do you think he's alive? Do you suspect anyone?" His voice cracked as he repeated the same words. "We just want Etan back." By the third day, the NYPD escalated. Helicopters were called in to sweep rooftops. Mounted units searched the riverside piers. Bloodhounds sniffed Eaton's clothing and wandered the streets, circling aimlessly before losing the scent near Worcester Street. That detail, losing the trail there, would haunt investigators for decades. Flyers multiplied. From Soho to Times Square, Etan's face looked back at commuters. Unlike most missing child posters, these images were crisp, professional. Stan's background as a photographer changed everything. The public could see Eaton's face as if he were standing right there. It was no longer abstract. It was personal. Still, the official narrative hesitated. Behind closed doors, some detectives muttered that maybe Etan had wandered off. Maybe he'd hopped a subway. Others whispered darker theories, an abduction, maybe by someone who knew the boy. But no ransom note came, no call demanding money. That silence chilled the Patzes more than anything. Julie refused to leave the loft, afraid she'd miss a call. Stan walked the neighborhood endlessly, retracing the same blocks, his eyes scanning every corner, as if Etan might suddenly step out of a doorway. The neighborhood changed, too. Parents who had once let their children roam freely suddenly clutched their hands tighter. Shopkeepers locked their doors earlier. The carefree rhythm of Soho, with its artists and street musicians, soured into suspicion. One strange and haunting detail: a street artist drew Etan's portrait in chalk on a Soho sidewalk. Passers-by stopped and stared, some in silence, some murmuring prayers. But when the first rain came, the face blurred and melted into the gutter, like the city itself refusing to hold on. The NYPD ramped up press coverage, calling it one of the most extensive missing child searches in city history. But for all the mobilization, there were no solid leads. No body, no clue. Just the echo of a child's footsteps that ended at a bus stop he never reached. By the end of the first week, a grim shift occurred. What had begun as a missing person case was now whispered as something else entirely: an abduction. The police weren't just searching anymore, they were hunting. And in that shift, the story of Etan Patz stopped belonging only to his family or his neighborhood. It became a citywide fear, a shadow cast over New York itself. Within days of Etan's disappearance, the case outgrew the boundaries of Soho. Reporters, camera crews, and news vans began clogging the narrow cobblestone streets. The front door of the Patz loft became a revolving stage, detectives going in, neighbors leaving with flyers, reporters angling for a soundbite. For Julie and Stan, it was surreal. Their private nightmare had become public property. Every morning they woke not only to the absence of their son, but also to the barrage of questions shouted by journalists. Do you think he's alive? Have the kidnappers contacted you? What are the police telling you? Stan, the photographer, understood the power of images better than anyone. He realized that the only weapon they had against time was Etan's face. Using his professional contacts, he arranged for high-quality prints to be made distributed not only in New York, but also mailed across state lines. Within weeks, Etan's face was staring back from bus stations, airports, and even national newspapers. That photograph with Etan's big eyes and the wide smile that revealed his missing front teeth would become one of the most recognizable missing child images in American history. For the first time, the media wasn't just reporting on a case, they were part of it. Something odd began happening in Soho. Strangers arrived, not journalists, but self-proclaimed psychics offering their visions of where Etan might be. One woman swore he was in a cabin in New Jersey. Another man insisted he'd seen him in the Bronx alive but frightened. Detectives politely took notes, but behind closed doors they rolled their eyes. Yet the flood of attention meant every lead had to be checked. Police resources stretched thin. The media, desperate for new angles, even started reporting on the psychics, and each false tip only widened the fog. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this media frenzy helped the case or fatally compromised it. Did the exposure keep Etan's name alive, making him a symbol, or did it drown out the real clues under mountains of noise? The pressure on NYPD grew unbearable. With cameras rolling, Chief of Detectives James Sullivan assured the public that every effort was being made. Helicopters buzzed overhead during live broadcasts, officers searched basements, while journalists shoved microphones at neighbors. For the first time in New York history, the disappearance of a single child had become a national spectacle. One unusual detail sticks out from that first week of coverage. A live broadcast showed a detective carefully lifting a small child's shoe found near a dumpster. The news anchor's voice trembled, suggesting this might be Etan's. Hours later, the police confirmed it wasn't his size, but the image of that tiny shoe lingered in viewers' minds, a haunting symbol of innocence lost. Stan and Julie struggled with the new reality of being public figures. Julie avoided cameras whenever possible, her grief too raw to be broadcast. Stan, however, stepped forward. He sat under studio lights, his voice cracking, pleading directly into the lens. "If you have my son, please just let him go," the nation responded. Letters poured in from strangers. Some sent prayers, some money, some just a sentence, "We're thinking of you." But among the sympathy came cruelty, anonymous callers insisting Etan was dead, or pranksters claiming to hold him for ransom. Every ring of the phone carried both hope and dread. One fact cemented Etan's story in American memory. On May 25, 1979, the day of his disappearance, news networks broke from their usual coverage to broadcast his face nationwide. It was the first time a missing child case dominated primetime news. The date, May 25th, would eventually be declared National Missing Children's Day in his honor. But for the Patz family, the honor meant nothing in that moment. It was a reminder that their boy was gone, his face plastered across America, not as a child, but as a cautionary tale. By the second week, the story had shifted. It wasn't just about Etan anymore, it was about all children. Parents across the country began asking the same question: if it could happen to him, could it happen to mine? That ripple effect changed playgrounds, changed parenting, changed trust itself. And yet behind the headlines, in the quiet of the loft, Julie sat staring at Etan's empty bed. The cameras never showed that part. The silence of a home where a child's laughter had vanished. The media storm had made Etan Patz a household name, but fame was no substitute for answers. The summer of 1979 was supposed to be light and carefree. New York was thawing after another bitter winter. Kids were riding bikes down Soho's cobblestones, and ice cream trucks played their tinny jingles. But after Etan Patz vanished, the air felt heavier. Parents who once leaned out loft windows to casually call their children in for dinner now gripped their hands tightly, escorting them to school playgrounds and even down the block to a friend's house. It wasn't just Soho anymore. It was Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx. Then it spread further suburbs in New Jersey towns, in Pennsylvania neighborhoods, in Chicago and Los Angeles. The case of one missing 6-year-old boy had cracked open a collective fear. If it could happen to him, it could happen anywhere. Television magnified that fear. Morning talk shows featured child psychologists warning parents to teach your children about strangers. Evening news anchors used Etan's photograph as a backdrop while talking about a new era of parenting. For decades, Americans had believed that children were safe in their neighborhoods, that abductions were rare and almost always by family members. Etan's story shattered that illusion. Something unusual began happening in grocery stores and shopping malls. Parents taped Etan's missing poster to bulletin boards right alongside lost cat notices and community bake sale flyers. His face had become a reminder, a ghost in plain sight, that no child was beyond danger. Meanwhile, across the country, law enforcement agencies began quietly reevaluating their procedures. Up until then, many departments had what they called a 48-hour rule. They often waited before fully mobilizing in missing child cases, assuming the child would return. But Etan's disappearance had shown how crucial the first hours could be. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this cultural shift began directly with Etan or whether it was the culmination of smaller cases bubbling under the surface. But in the eyes of parents, it was clear Etan was the tipping point. In Washington, lawmakers took notice. Senators received letters from constituents demanding better child safety laws. For the first time, missing children wasn't seen as an individual tragedy, it was a national issue. Advocacy groups began forming. Parents who had lost children in unrelated cases reached out to the Patzes, offering solidarity, but also channeling their grief into action. One eerie coincidence haunted the conversation at the same time. Etan's case dominated headlines. A series of child disappearances in Atlanta was just beginning what would later become the Atlanta child murders. To many, it felt as though a hidden epidemic of vanished children was being exposed all at once. Back in Soho, the Patz loft remained a hub of activity. Volunteers manned phones. Neighbors stapled flyers onto wooden poles until their hands blistered. Strangers mailed in donations to help cover printing costs. And yet, for all the movement, there was no breakthrough, no ransom call, no sighting that held up. Stan began photographing the search itself, volunteers, flyers, detectives, empty streets at dawn. It was his way of controlling the chaos, of making sure every detail was preserved. Some of those photos would later circulate as stark visual reminders of how one child's disappearance galvanized an entire city. One detail from those months still unsettles people: the milk cartons. By 1984, Etan's face was one of the first to appear on milk cartons across the country, a program designed to make his story unavoidable at breakfast tables. But years earlier, in 1979, local grocers had already experimented with a smaller version, putting Etan's image on store flyers and receipts. Shoppers described the strange feeling of holding their groceries while staring at the smiling face of a missing child. It was as though everyday life had been infected by the shadow of Etan's absence. Shh! The Patz family, still living in the same loft, had to balance two lives: the private one where they grieved and the public one where they fought. Julie cooked meals for their other children, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. Stan fielded interviews, sometimes with anger simmering just below the surface, furious that after so much exposure, no answers had come. By fall, the story had transformed. Etan Patz was no longer just a missing boy. He had become a symbol of a new kind of fear, a face that represented every parent's nightmare. And though the case remained unsolved, America had already changed. The way parents thought, the way police responded, the way the media covered missing children, all of it traced back to a single morning in May when a 6-year-old boy never made it to his school bus. For months, the search for Etan Patz had produced little more than exhaustion. Flyers curled and yellowed on lampposts. The number of volunteers dwindled. Detectives recycled theories in long, cigarette-choked rooms. But out of the fog of leads, one name began to resurface more often than others: Jose Ramos. Ramos was not just another face in the city. He had a history, a troubling one. He was a drifter living in and out of apartments around Manhattan with a background of inappropriate relationships with young boys. At the time, he was dating a woman who worked as Etan's babysitter. That coincidence alone was enough to make investigators lean in closer. One strange detail stuck out: Ramos allegedly admitted in vague terms to taking a boy on the same day Etan disappeared. He told acquaintances he had lured a child into a drainpipe in the East Village to play with toys. The description of that boy, blonde, about 6 years old, was disturbingly close to Etan. But there was a problem: evidence. No body, no definitive link. And in 1979, without DNA, investigators were trapped in a cycle of conjecture. They interrogated Ramos, followed him, tried to catch him slipping. He denied direct involvement with Etan, though he admitted to being attracted to little boys. For detectives hardened by years of cases, the chilling frankness was enough to freeze them. Still, it wasn't a confession. It wasn't a charge. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Ramos was the prime suspect all along, or whether his proximity and record simply made him a convenient villain. Some argued he was the embodiment of every parent's darkest suspicion. Others countered that it was dangerous to fixate on one man too early to ignore other leads that might drift by unseen. The Patz family learned of Ramos, and Stan in particular grew obsessed. Over the years, he made it his personal mission to pin Ramos down. When officials moved too slowly, Stan filed a civil suit himself, eventually winning a judgment in 2004 that declared Ramos responsible for Etan's death. It was a symbolic victory: no prison term, no closure, but it cemented Ramos in the public imagination as the likely predator. Meanwhile, other suspects had surfaced briefly and then vanished just as quickly. A local handyman was rumored to have been watching children in the neighborhood. A shopkeeper was said to have spoken oddly to detectives. Tips poured in about strange vans parked in Soho, about men seen loitering near the bus stop. Each one was case-logged and eventually discarded, but Ramos lingered. He was like a storm cloud on the horizon, too large to ignore. What made the Ramos angle even more unsettling was his location during key years. He was eventually imprisoned in Pennsylvania for unrelated child molestation charges. While in custody, he allegedly made statements to investigators that "Etan is my case and I was the one." Yet when pressed, his stories shifted, warped, crumbled under scrutiny. It was almost as if he enjoyed the attention, the power of dangling answers in front of desperate parents and detectives. By the mid-1980s, Ramos had become a household name in the Patz saga. Media whispered about him, television shows speculated, and neighbors spoke his name with venom. But even with the suspicion wrapped around him like a noose, the case remained legally unsolved. No indictment tied to Etan, no trial, just a shadow hovering over the Patz family year after year. In hindsight, some detectives wondered if the fixation on Ramos narrowed their vision too much. Could there have been someone else, another predator in Soho that morning? Another twist of fate that had nothing to do with Ramos? The debate was endless, but the effect was clear: suspicion had a name, and that name was Jose Ramos. And yet, the little boy at the center of it all, Etan, was still missing. Julie Patz still set a place for Etan at the kitchen table for months after his disappearance. It was an act of hope, or perhaps denial, but also a quiet ritual of defiance. To her, Etan's absence couldn't be allowed to erase his presence. The loft in Soho was filled with reminders: his drawings taped to the fridge, his little sneakers by the door, his favorite toy truck sitting abandoned on the windowsill. Stan, meanwhile, carried his grief differently. As a professional photographer, he turned the camera on the unfolding nightmare. He photographed the search parties, the press conferences, the hundreds of strangers who stapled Etan's poster to lampposts and brick walls. For Stan, the lens wasn't just documentation, it was survival. Each image was proof that the world still cared about his son, but behind closed doors, the strain was brutal. Julie and Stan fought at times, their grief twisting into frustration. One blamed the other for letting Etan walk alone that morning. One would retreat into silence while the other pushed forward with media interviews. Their marriage, by all accounts, teetered on the edge of collapse. And yet they stayed together, bound not only by love but by the unbearable reality that no one else on earth could understand the exact shape of their pain. The Patzes were constantly under a spotlight. Journalists rang their buzzer at all hours. Photographers staked out their building. News vans idled on the street below. Julie once remarked that it felt like living inside a fishbowl, every moment of grief on display, every movement scrutinized by strangers, and yet they bore it. Because with the media came exposure, and with exposure came the chance, however small, that someone somewhere might recognize Etan and bring him home. One unusual detail from those years, Julie began collecting letters from strangers. Hundreds arrived, some offering sympathy, others offering tips, still others filled with bizarre theories. A handful even claimed psychic visions of Etan, describing him alive in faraway places. She didn't believe them, but she read them all, hoping that somewhere amid the noise, one letter might hold truth. Stan, on the other hand, turned increasingly toward activism. He pushed for broader awareness campaigns, working with groups that lobbied for missing children to be given immediate national attention. When Etan's face became one of the first to appear on milk cartons in 1984, it was partly due to Stan's relentless insistence that his son's image not fade away. The years piled on, and the loft remained the same, a home that was also a shrine, a prison, a reminder. Etan's younger siblings grew up under that shadow. They were protected fiercely, never allowed the freedoms their brother once had. Friends recalled how the Patz children were escorted everywhere, their parents' eyes constantly scanning for danger. Julie's quiet resilience, contrasted with Stan's fiery determination, became a strange balance. She anchored the family, ensuring dinner was made, homework was done, routines maintained. He waged the external war, battling the system, pushing the media, filing lawsuits. And always the presence of Jose Ramos hovered like smoke. Stan was obsessed with him, convinced beyond doubt that Ramos was the man who had taken his boy. He collected evidence, tracked his whereabouts, even confronted authorities who had given up. Julie, weary from the endless chase, sometimes wished he would let go, if only for the family's sanity. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Stan's singular focus on Ramos kept pressure on the case or narrowed it too much, blinding him and perhaps law enforcement to other possibilities. But to Stan, it wasn't a debate. It was the truth. What no one could deny was that the Patzes had become symbols. They were no longer just grieving parents, they were public figures, representatives of an entire movement about missing children. Their names appeared in magazines, their faces on television. And while that exposure gave them purpose, it also meant they could never truly retreat, never truly heal. In quiet moments, Julie would still set Etan's place at the table. She would glance at the empty chair, at the fading drawings on the fridge, and whisper a silent promise: "We haven't stopped looking." And Stan, through the lens of his camera, continued to frame the tragedy of a boy gone missing in the city that never sleeps. Confession is a strange thing. It can be a lifeline for grieving families or a weapon that cuts them deeper. For Julie and Stan Patz, the 1980s and 1990s brought a grim parade of both. Not long after Etan's disappearance, the NYPD and FBI began receiving tips that sounded promising, but almost none held water. Then came the confessions. Some arrived in letters, others were whispered by jailhouse informants hoping for lighter sentences. A few came in the form of men walking into precincts and flat out declaring, "I killed Etan Patz." Most were dismissed within hours. They didn't know details. They contradicted themselves. They were obviously unwell. But every single time detectives had to check. And every single time Stan and Julie were forced to ride that nauseating roller coaster of hope and despair. One confession stood out. In 1982, a drifter in New Jersey told police he had abducted a boy in Manhattan, describing details that seemed to match Etan's case. He claimed he had buried the body in a wooded area. For days, officers dug where he pointed, pulling up root soil and nothing more. The man eventually admitted he had fabricated the story for attention. Another came in 1985, when Jose Ramos, the convicted child molester already on Stan's radar, allegedly admitted in passing to a prison informant that he had taken a little boy in New York. The detail was chilling, yet Ramos himself denied it outright when questioned, oscillating between eerie silence and outright hostility. Investigators noted his refusal to fully cooperate, fueling suspicion. Still, nothing concrete linked him to Etan. One unusual detail from this period: a psychic in Florida sent Julie a hand-drawn map claiming Etan's body lay beneath a specific highway overpass. The map was oddly precise, almost like blueprints. Authorities humored the tip, searched the area, and again found nothing. Julie later admitted she kept the map folded in a drawer for years, unable to throw it away. And then there were the false friends. A man once called the Patz household directly, his voice calm and deliberate, claiming he knew where Etan was being held. He demanded money in exchange for information. Stan stayed on the line while Julie contacted police. The call was traced to a payphone, and the man was never identified. Detectives found themselves trapped in a cycle. Every confession had to be investigated, no matter how outlandish. Each lead consumed time, manpower, and hope. For the Patz family, the cruelty wasn't just in the lies, it was in the fleeting possibility that one of them might, against all odds, be true. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this flood of confessions helped or hindered the case. On one hand, they kept Etan's story alive in the media, ensuring he was never forgotten. On the other, they drained resources and left the truth buried under layers of noise. Perhaps the strangest confession came from outside the United States. In the early 1990s, a man in Europe wrote to American authorities describing dreams he had of a boy with blonde hair being locked in a basement. He insisted these dreams were memories of a crime he had committed while visiting New York years earlier. Authorities looked into his travel records and found he had never even been in the United States at the time of Etan's disappearance. It would almost be laughable if not for the fact that every bizarre letter, every deranged phone call landed like shrapnel in the Patz household. Julie once said it felt as though people were borrowing her son's tragedy, twisting it into their own narratives for attention or release. And yet, amid the noise, suspicion always drifted back to one name: Ramos. Stan clung to the prison informant story, convinced it was the closest they had ever come to truth. Julie, weary from disappointment, urged caution. She no longer trusted confessions written or spoken. She had seen too many crumble under scrutiny. Still, the damage of these strange claims lingered. They blurred the lines between fact and fiction, truth and fantasy. And perhaps most painfully, they left the question echoing louder than ever: if all these confessions were false, then where was the real one? Where was Etan? Time does strange things to memory. Buildings go up, businesses close, faces blur. Yet for Stan and Julie Patz, May 25, 1979, remained frozen in amber. New York City did not. By the late 1980s, the city that had once felt lawless began to shift. Crack cocaine ravaged neighborhoods, crime spiked, and headlines filled with stories of violence. But Soho, the once gritty industrial area where the Patz family lived, was undergoing its own transformation. Artists drawn to cheap lofts made the neighborhood bohemian. Then came the gallerists, the boutiques, the real estate developers. Soho was becoming fashionable, and the streets where Etan once walked to his bus stop were now lined with upscale shops and cafes. For strangers visiting, it was easy to forget the boy who had vanished here, but not for the locals. Residents still remembered Etan's face, his shy smile on those missing posters that never seemed to come down. The Patz family refused to let the city erase him. Stan, in particular, was relentless. He would set up annual events, print flyers, and push media outlets to keep Etan's name alive. One unusual detail, as gentrification marched on the very building the Patz family lived in, became a landmark of sorts. New neighbors often whispered about it, aware of the dark story tied to its walls. Some even admitted to feeling uneasy walking past. It was as though the block itself held its breath, remembering. And while the city changed, the case remained maddeningly still. Leads went cold, confessions evaporated. Detectives rotated in and out of the precinct, each inheriting a box filled with decades of files, photos, and unanswered questions. Many retired with the case unsolved. For younger officers, Etan's disappearance was a ghost story, a cautionary tale of what happens when a child vanishes without a trace in one of the busiest cities in the world. Meanwhile, the Patz family had to live inside this contradiction. Their world was stuck in 1979, but everything around them was moving on. Friends had more children, those children grew up, and the city learned to smile again. But Stan and Julie still kept Etan's room, still clung to hope, still opened the door every time a detective called with news, only to close it again when the news dissolved into another dead end. One debate that still circles among investigators and criminologists is whether New York's transformation into a safer city in the 1990s helped or hindered the case. On one hand, improved policing and technology meant better chances of solving cold cases. On the other, the very changes in neighborhoods like Soho erased potential witnesses and memories. People who might have seen something back in 1979 were gone, scattered by rent hikes and city migration. The city's progress had unintentionally swept away pieces of the puzzle. But every May 25th, something extraordinary happened. While the city bustled on with its new rhythms, Stan and Julie stood still, and the nation stood with them. Etan's disappearance had sparked National Missing Children's Day, recognized officially in 1983. Every year, while new cases of missing children were remembered, the name Etan Patz was always spoken. It was a bittersweet victory. The boy who vanished had become a symbol, a reminder etched into the country's calendar. Yet symbols don't hug you back. They don't walk through the door. They don't answer the question of where your son is. For the Patz family, May 25th was less a day of honor and more a reminder of the eternal wound. And still Stan fought. His campaign against Ramos grew louder. He refused to let the system ignore the man he believed had answers. He gave interviews, spoke at rallies, and pushed legislators to tighten laws around child safety. In many ways, Stan Patz became as much a part of the city's identity as the case itself. One local journalist once described him as a man living in two New Yorks, the one everyone else sees and the one that ended on Prince Street in 1979. By the 2000s, Soho was unrecognizable. Designer stores replaced corner bodegas, tourists filled sidewalks once walked by factory workers, and crime rates had plummeted. But one poster still clung stubbornly to a lamppost, faded, weather-beaten, yet legible. "Have you seen this child?" Etan's eyes still watched over the neighborhood, bridging the chasm of time. And as new generations strolled past that lamppost, most didn't know the story. They didn't realize they were walking across a living crime scene, a neighborhood shaped by one boy's disappearance. For Julie and Stan, that was perhaps the cruelest part of all. The city had changed, the case had not, and no matter how many decades passed, their son was still out there somewhere waiting for someone to find him. It was April 2012 when jackhammers broke the silence of Prince Street. More than 30 years had passed since Etan Patz vanished, and now a swarm of police officers, FBI agents, and forensic experts descended on a building just a few doors down from the Patz family loft. For decades, whispers had haunted this address, 127B Prince Street. It was once the workspace of Othniel Miller, a neighborhood handyman who knew Etan and had reportedly given him $1 the day before he disappeared. Investigators had long been uneasy about Miller, but without physical evidence, suspicion remained suspicion. Now, with new leads and modern forensic technology, authorities decided to dig literally. The plan was simple but chilling: tear up the concrete floor of Miller's old basement, sift through the earth beneath, and search for anything that might connect to a boy who never made it to school. From the outside, the scene looked like something out of a movie. Police tape cordoned off the street news vans, idled with cameras trained on the entrance, and curious crowds gathered behind barriers. People who had lived in Soho for decades watched silently, their faces heavy with the weight of memory. Younger passers-by whispered, some barely aware of Etan's story, others stunned to learn they were walking over a possible grave. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, clinical. The basement was dark and damp, the kind of space where secrets seemed to cling to the walls. Workers drilled into the concrete slab, the sound reverberating like a heartbeat. Dust filled the air as chunks of the old floor were pried away, revealing the soil underneath. Forensic teams scooped the dirt, carefully bagging samples, examining every fragment. And then came a moment that rippled through the entire investigation. A small piece of bone was found, fragile, tiny, enough to ignite headlines around the world. Could it be Etan? The press went into overdrive. Reporters typed feverishly, broadcasters leaned into their microphones, and the story leapt across continents. After more than 3 decades, was this the break everyone had been waiting for? But as days stretched on, hope turned into another cruel twist. Lab results came back, and the fragment was not human. It belonged to an animal buried years before. The basement dig, despite its intensity, yielded nothing: no clothing, no personal effects, no traces of a 6-year-old boy lost in 1979. The disappointment hit hard. The Patz family, who had braced themselves for yet another storm, were left once again with empty hands. Julie later admitted she had stayed away from the scene, unwilling to relive the trauma of false hope. Stan, ever the vigilant fighter, watched with his usual quiet resolve, but even he seemed drained when the results came back negative. And yet the basement dig had a strange ripple effect. Though no remains were found, the action jolted the city awake. It reminded everyone that the case was still open, still breathing, still demanding answers. One unusual detail: the dig exposed how thin the line was between evidence and absence. Investigators admitted that even if Etan had been buried there, time and renovations could have erased all traces. Concrete poured over soil chemicals. Moisture, decades of urban life could obliterate even the smallest fragment. This uncertainty left a chilling thought: the truth might have been destroyed long before anyone thought to look. But the dig also reignited debate. Detectives, criminologists, and armchair investigators still argue whether Miller, the handyman, had anything to do with Etan's disappearance. Some say he was a convenient scapegoat, a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others remain convinced that his proximity and behavior should not be ignored. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the basement dig closed the door on Miller's involvement or whether it left it wide open. For the public, the 2012 excavation was both a spectacle and a heartbreak. People wanted closure. They wanted the story of Etan Patz to end with answers, not more silence. But instead of clarity, the dig offered only dust rumors and the sound of concrete cracking in vain. And for the Patz family, it was just another reminder of the cruel rhythm they had been trapped in for decades: hope, suspicion, and disappointment all over again. Still, this was not the end. Because out of the shadows of the failed dig, another name would soon reemerge: a man whose conscience couldn't stay quiet. A man who would finally crack the case open. It was May 2012, just weeks after the failed basement dig. The Patz family had once again been let down by silence, but then came an unexpected jolt, a confession that seemed to materialize out of nowhere: the name Pedro Hernandez. He was not a figure anyone had been watching for decades, not a man on the long lists of suspects that investigators had chased through the years. Instead, Hernandez was a 51-year-old former bodega clerk who had lived quietly in Mapleshade, New Jersey with his wife and daughter. He seemed ordinary, even forgettable, until one day during a church prayer group he told fellow worshippers something chilling. He admitted that he had killed a child in New York back in 1979. Word of this confession reached authorities. It was vague, but it was enough. Detectives picked up the thread, and soon Hernandez was brought into custody. In the interview room under the fluorescent hum of police headquarters, Hernandez began to talk. What he described sent shivers down the spines of seasoned investigators. He claimed that on the morning of May 25, 1979, as little Etan walked toward his school bus stop, Hernandez lured him into the basement of the bodega, where he worked just 1 block away from the Patz loft. He said he offered Etan a soda. Once inside, Hernandez claimed he suddenly strangled the boy, stuffed his small body into a box, and later left the box with the trash on the street. The words hung in the air. Investigators who had chased false leads for over 30 years leaned forward, torn between relief and skepticism. Could it be true? After all this time, was this finally the answer? But there were problems, big ones. Hernandez's confession lacked detail. He couldn't remember certain things that should have stood out, like the clothes Etan wore that day, or what time the bus usually came. His story had holes, gaps where memory should have been. More troubling, there was no physical evidence to back him up. No body, no trace. Nothing left after 3 decades. Some detectives immediately wondered if this was just another false confession. It happens more often than people realize. Cases where vulnerable individuals, often with mental health struggles, admit to crimes they didn't commit. Hernandez had a documented history of psychiatric illness, including hallucinations and delusions. That made his words even harder to trust, and yet there was something unnervingly sincere about his tone. He spoke softly, almost apologetically, as if unburdening himself of a secret that had rotted inside for years. Investigators pressed him again and again, and he didn't waver from his core story: I killed a child. I killed Etan Patz. The news broke like a thunderclap. New York tabloids plastered Hernandez's photo across their front pages. Television anchors leaned into the camera, telling viewers that after more than 30 years, the case might finally be solved. The public was torn. Some saw Hernandez as the long-hidden monster who had haunted Etan's path to school. Others thought it was another cruel twist, a desperate man seeking attention or redemption by confessing to a crime he hadn't committed. And here's the strange detail that unsettled many: Hernandez had told his family long before this. His wife and relatives admitted that over the years, he'd whispered fragments of this story: how he'd killed a child in New York, how he couldn't forget. They had dismissed it as the ramblings of a troubled mind, never believing it was real. Imagine living under one roof with someone carrying that secret and brushing it off as nothing. Prosecutors faced a brutal decision. On one hand, they finally had a confession. On the other, confessions without evidence are dangerous. They can crumble in court, or worse, convict the wrong person. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Hernandez's words alone should have carried the weight they did. But the timing was uncanny. After the basement dig yielded nothing, here was a man stepping forward voluntarily with no clear motive to lie. It was enough for the Manhattan District Attorney to move forward. Pedro Hernandez was arrested, charged with Etan's murder, and prepared to stand trial. The Patz family, who had weathered more than 3 decades of anguish, faced another storm. Could this be the real answer, or was it just another false hope? One thing was certain: for the first time in years, Etan's case wasn't cold anymore. It was burning. The trial of Pedro Hernandez began in 2015, more than 3 decades after Etan Patz vanished. By then, Hernandez was in his mid-50s, frail, soft-spoken, with eyes that darted nervously under the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. To some, he looked nothing like a killer. To others, that quiet demeanor seemed to match the kind of man who might commit a crime and bury it beneath years of silence. The courtroom was packed: journalists, law students, retired detectives, curious locals, and of course the Patz family, seated with the weight of 35 years on their shoulders. The prosecution wasted no time. They leaned heavily on Hernandez's own words. He had confessed multiple times to police, to prosecutors, and in chilling detail during videotaped interrogations. He said he strangled Etan, placed his small body in a box, and set that box out with the garbage. The tapes were played in court, and the jury watched as Hernandez, voice trembling, admitted to taking the boy's life. Some jurors looked down, others shook their heads, disturbed by the casual horror of his tone. But then came the defense. Their strategy was simple yet devastating: undermine Hernandez's reliability. They argued that Hernandez suffered from mental illness, including schizotypal personality disorder. They brought in experts who testified that Hernandez was highly suggestible, prone to confabulation, and could easily be led into believing he had committed acts he hadn't. They pointed out the glaring holes in his story. He couldn't remember exactly what Etan was wearing. He couldn't pinpoint the bus stop details. He couldn't recall what he did with the supposed box afterward. And most importantly, there was no physical evidence. Not a shred, no body, no clothing, no DNA. Nothing to link Hernandez to Etan Patz beyond his own words. The defense hammered the jury with this fact without evidence. Could they really convict a man based only on a possibly false confession? The trial stretched on for months, and the tension inside the courtroom became suffocating. Each day felt like a tug of war between certainty and doubt. One strange detail that jurors learned: Hernandez had confessed not just to police, but to his church prayer group years earlier, and even to his family members. These weren't isolated admissions. He had carried the story with him for decades, whispering it when he thought he was safe. That gave his confession a disturbing kind of credibility. But defense lawyers countered with another unnerving point. People with severe psychiatric conditions sometimes invent stories to match their inner turmoil. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Hernandez truly revealed guilt or simply acted out his illness in the most tragic way imaginable. When it came time for the jury to deliberate, the city held its breath. Days passed, then weeks. Finally, word came: the jury was deadlocked. 11 jurors believed Hernandez was guilty. 1 did not. A mistrial was declared. The disappointment was seismic. The Patz family had once again been pulled to the edge of closure, only to watch it slip away. Reporters scrambled for reactions, and public opinion split down the middle. Some said it proved Hernandez was the killer, but reasonable doubt had blocked justice. Others said it proved exactly the opposite, that the case was too flimsy to convict. But prosecutors were not done. They announced almost immediately that they would retry Hernandez. The second trial began in 2016. This time the strategy was sharper, more refined. The prosecution focused intensely on the consistency of Hernandez's confessions, while the defense doubled down on his mental illness. By 2017, after another exhausting courtroom battle, the verdict finally came: guilty of murder and kidnapping. The jury had reached consensus. Pedro Hernandez was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. For the Patz family, it was not the resolution they had always dreamed of. Etan's body was never found, his last moments still cloaked in darkness, but it was at last an answer. Julie Patz, ever the quiet one, said little publicly. Stan Patz, who had carried Etan's face like a torch for decades, finally exhaled, though not with relief, more with exhaustion. After 38 years, the name of their son's killer was written into the record. When the gavel struck and Pedro Hernandez was sentenced to 25 years to life, the courtroom exhaled, but not in celebration. It was a quieter, more complicated release. For nearly 4 decades, the name Etan Patz had been synonymous with America's fear of losing a child. Now, with a conviction at last, the world tried to understand what justice really meant when so much remained unknown. Stan and Julie Patz walked out of the courthouse arm in arm. They had lived with Etan's absence longer than they had lived with his presence. 38 years since their 6-year-old walked out the door and never came back. For them, closure was not possible. Justice, yes, but closure. That was a word for someone else. Julie said almost nothing. Stan, in his measured way, spoke about Etan not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as his boy. He reminded reporters that behind the decades of speculation, behind the debates about confessions and suspects, there was a child who loved to draw, who carried his school books in a small bag, who never got to grow up. Etan's case had long ago expanded far beyond his family. His disappearance had changed America. One hard historical fact: Etan Patz was the first child whose photo appeared on a milk carton. In the early 1980s, millions of Americans began their morning staring at the faces of missing children alongside their breakfast. It was haunting, effective, and unforgettable. For years, milk cartons carried the message a child is missing and your eyes might bring them home. Eaton's story also inspired President Ronald Reagan to declare May 25th, the day Eaton vanished, as National Missing Children's Day in 1983. That tradition continues to this day, reminding the nation of the vulnerability of children and the responsibility of communities. And perhaps most importantly, Etan's case sparked the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 1984, which has since helped locate tens of thousands of children across the country. Etan's absence had forced the nation to change how it looked at child safety. But the case also raised troubling questions about justice. The conviction of Pedro Hernandez was not a slam dunk. It was based almost entirely on his confession, a confession many experts still debate. Was he telling the truth? Was his mind so fractured that he believed a false memory? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Hernandez truly killed Etan or whether another suspect like Jose Ramos, the man once strongly linked to the case, was the real culprit. One strange detail that lingers during the retrial: one juror admitted he couldn't stop picturing Etan's small frame walking into that bodega, lured by the promise of a soda. It wasn't evidence, but it was human. The image of that moment carried as much weight in hearts as it did in law. For the public, the case left an indelible mark. Parents who had grown up with the milk carton campaigns remembered checking their own children twice before letting them walk to school. Neighborhoods across America tightened their watch, introducing stranger danger programs, ID photos, and new emergency protocols. And for New Yorkers, Prince Street became more than an address. It was a landmark of loss, a reminder that even in the heart of the city, a child could vanish without a trace. Decades later, the name Etan Patz still flickers in the collective memory. Some recall him as the boy who changed the way parents thought about safety. Others recall him as a symbol of justice delayed but not denied. But for Stan and Julie Patz, he was never just a symbol. He was their son. And the most chilling part of this story is that no conviction, no courtroom, no annual day of remembrance could bring him back. Etan's absence had reshaped America. But his presence, small, smiling, filled with possibility, was what mattered most. The years rolled forward, but Etan's shadow lingered. His name was carved not only into the history of New York City, but into the broader cultural memory of America. By the time the 2010s came to a close, his case was a touchstone, a cautionary tale, and a reminder of what could be lost in the blink of an eye. Stan and Julie Patz never moved from their loft on Prince Street. People asked them why. Why stay in the same building on the same street where every corner was a reminder of Etan's last day? But Stan always had the same answer: because this is where he lived. This is where he belongs. The walls were filled with photographs, old drawings, and the kind of small mementos only parents keep: a favorite toy, a crayon sketch folded into a drawer. Time had preserved Etan in those objects, as if the boy himself might walk through the door and reclaim them at any moment. The wider world had taken Etan's story and woven it into activism, policy, and prevention. Parents who were children themselves back in 1979 told their kids about the boy on the milk carton. Teachers reminded students during safety drills that the routines they followed had roots in tragedies like his. In that way, Etan became a silent guardian of sorts, his disappearance ensuring that fewer children would vanish unnoticed. But the central question never left: who really took Etan? Yes, Pedro Hernandez sat in prison. His face became tied to the narrative, the shy, mentally unstable store clerk who one day confessed. But doubts lingered, gnawed at the edges of the verdict. Experts in criminal psychology pointed out that false confessions were not uncommon among people with fragile mental states. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Hernandez was truly guilty, or whether the confession was a mirage, his way of inserting himself into a tragedy he only dimly remembered. And then there was Jose Ramos, the drifter with a record of abusing children, a man who had dated Etan's babysitter, who had even admitted to being 90% sure he had harmed the boy. Ramos spent decades in prison for unrelated crimes, and when he was released, suspicion still hung over him like smoke. For some, the case was never solved. One haunting, strange detail, the 1985 search of a drain in a Bronx apartment building where Ramos once lived, turned up children's photographs, scraps of evidence, things that felt like trophies. None of them were definitively tied to Etan, but the discovery kept the whispers alive. The Patz family learned to live with uncertainty. They had justice, at least legally, but no closure. Etan's body was never found. His final moments were never clarified. And yet his story carried weight far beyond its unanswered questions. Every May 25th, National Missing Children's Day, families across the country lit candles, shared photographs, and remembered. Etan's absence had grown into a movement of protection and remembrance. As the decades piled up, Etan's name became a kind of quiet prayer invoked by those who worked in child safety, by police detectives who never gave up on cold cases, by parents who checked twice that their kids made it to school. He was gone, but his presence was everywhere. The loft on Prince Street still stood its windows, looking out over a city that had changed 100 times since 1979. Inside, the Patz family kept Etan alive in memory, as a boy forever 6 years old, frozen on the morning of May 25th. And that is where this story rests, not with the finality of justice, not with the satisfaction of a solved case, but with the enduring mystery of a child who walked into history simply by disappearing. Etan Patz is gone. The world moved forward, but the boy with the shy smile, the child who never got to grow up, will never be forgotten. And now, before we let the night close in, here's a softer reflection just for you. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones filled with monsters or haunted houses. Sometimes it's the everyday morning, a school bag, a crosswalk, a goodbye kiss that's supposed to lead into tomorrow. Etan's story reminds us how fragile life can be, how quickly innocence can be interrupted. But it also reminds us of the power of memory. A child's face remembered by millions, a family's resilience carried through decades, a country's determination to never let such stories fade into silence. So as you settle deeper into your chair, maybe you hear the faint sound of the city outside, or maybe just the quiet of your own home. Let the image soften. The streets blur, the voices dim, and the little boy who once walked into the morning becomes just a gentle figure in the distance. Close your eyes. Let the weight of history drift away.